53 of the Standing Committee on Science and Research. Today's meeting is taking place in a hybrid format pursuant to standing orders. Members are in person in this room, and we do have a witness via Zoom. Just a few comments about the benefits, or for the benefits of the witnesses or witness. Please wait until I recognize you by name before speaking, and click on the microphone icon to activate your mic. When speaking, speak slowly and clearly for the interpreters. And also, when you're not speaking, your mic should be on mute. You also have the option of interpretation where you can choose either the floor, English, or French for your convenience. Although this room is equipped with a powerful audio system, feedback events can occur, so be very careful with your earphone and the microphone. Keep them apart so that we can prevent injuries to our interpreters. It's great to see our witness using a House of Commons approved device, which is now mandatory, and the sound checks have been done, so we should be good to go on that front. In accordance with the committee's routine motion concerning connection tests for witnesses, the witness, I can let you know that the witnesses have completed all the checks that are needed. And again, to the members to address your comments through the chair. And welcome to Larry McGuire. It's good to have you joining us as a substitute on the committee. And we also have Ken McDonald joining us as a sub. And thank you to our witnesses for preparing to be here, both in person and virtually, to help us with the study that we're working on. It's my pleasure pursuant to Standing Order 108.3.1 and the motion adopted by the committee on Tuesday, June 6, 2023, the committee commences its study on the use of federal government research and development grants, funds, and contributions by Canadian universities and research institutions in partnerships with entities connected to the People's Republic of China. So I wish we had a short version of that, but even the taking one letter would take me a while. It's my pleasure to welcome our witnesses today from the Alliance Canada Hong Kong, Cherie Wong, who's the Executive Director. Welcome back to the House of Commons for being a witness. And Benjamin Fung, welcome to the House of Commons for your first time, the Canada Research Chair and Professor from McGill University. And we also have joining us from the University of Alberta, and I think I heard you say you might be in British Columbia right now, Greg Holden, who's a professor, and he's also works with the China Institute. You'll each have 5 minutes for your presentations or for your opening remarks. I believe the 5 minutes is going to be split with our first witnesses, and you can start with your presentation.
Thank you. Good afternoon, Chair and committee members. I am a professor and Canada Research Chair at McGill University. My research interests include AI, cybersecurity, and malware analysis. The CCP and the Chinese state-affiliated companies expressed strong interest in my research. In the past years, a large Chinese 5G company repeatedly approached me for different collaborations. In 2018, a Chinese company attempted to recruit me as a consultant in their AI team. That company offers 3 times of my salary to work for them as a consultant, while I can remain as a professor at McGill. Out of my curiosity, I asked them, "What do you want me to do?" Their response was, "You just need to reply to our emails." In Chinese, this recruitment strategy is called feed, trap, and kill. They first use lucrative offers to attract the target. Once a professor relies on their funding, they will start making unreasonable requests, including transferring IP rights, getting sensitive data, or asking the professor to say something that may not be true. After I rejected their offer, they contact me every 1 or 2 years and offering different types of collaborations. And they also started to approach my graduate students. Fortunately, none of my students have joined the company. Through the China Scholarship Council, CSC, Many international students from China are fully funded to study and participate in research in Canada. Not many people understand that international students face undue pressure and funding agreements from the Chinese government. If the students violate the rule or refuse to follow the instruction, the Chinese government would ask their family to pay back the scholarship. As a professor, I fully understand and respect the importance of academic freedom, but universities have the responsibility to explain the risk to professors who take CSC-sponsored students in their research teams. Some of the risks can be mitigated if university research officers are educated in identifying foreign interference and foreign state entities. I'm happy to share other CCP's infiltrations in the academic community. Thank you. Now I pass the floor to Sherry.
Thank you, Ben. Mr. Chair, I have witnessed Beijing's influence in Canadian academia and the research sector, as ACHK has heard from these concerned community members, and also my own observations as a graduate student at Carleton University Sociology and Anthropology Department. Soft sciences on the surface may not directly contribute to Beijing's technological and military ambitions, but what we're seeing is the Chinese party state weaving other regime security objectives such as elite capture, censorship, disinformation, and narrative discursion into these areas. I like to stress this important point. While Chinese interference is gaining significant scrutiny in Canada, Beijing will not be the only foreign principal interested in Canadian research. We must create country-agnostic solutions to address vulnerabilities in academia. Whether domestic or international students, Tibetans, Uyghurs, Chinese, Taiwanese, and Hong Kongers are experiencing transnational surveillance and fear of reprisal on university campuses. International students also expressed the concerns of embassies, consulates, and their home government to revoke study permits or scholarships for unfavorable views, actions, or inactions. Academic freedom requires ongoing work to proactively adapt and meet new challenges as they arise. Canada must strengthen our academic and research environment, which will require whole-of-society collaboration with universities, research institutions, private sector, and student unions. When collaborating with individuals outside of Canada, we must also consider the risk and intention of our international partners. Stronger privacy and data protection laws can prevent Canadian sensitive data from being transferred, exported, or sold to foreign actors, encouraging Canadian universities and research institutions to keep university servers and research data in Canada, as well as implement stronger cybersecurity measures and policies on campus. I strongly encourage the committee to review Alliance Canada Hong Kong's previous report in plain sight, particularly our chapter on academic influence and vulnerability of intellectual property transfer. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And you might want to include that and send it in to the clerk so that we can have that on file. Now we'll go to Professor Holden from the University of Alberta for 5 minutes, please.
Thank you very much. And Chair, I intend to use my full 5 minutes if that's possible. Don't hesitate to cut me off, of course. I wish to thank the members, the chair and the members of the committee for this opportunity. It's always an honor to speak to our House of Commons. The topic of research security has gained in profile and significance and pace with the rise of the PRC to global status as a near peer to the United States in terms of national power. The reality that China is a potential adversary to Canada, and combined with China's sharply different political system, requires that attention be paid to risks that may arise from the leakage of Canadian intellectual property and know-how from our leading post-secondary institutions and corporate research laboratories. In May of this year, I presented to the Government of Alberta a comprehensive confidential report on academic research security, which they had commissioned and which took several months of research. The subject, as you know, and we've already heard this morning, is complex and is often the case with international relations. And our G7 allies have also paid much closer attention to this issue as well. However, the policy response requires careful examination and thought in order to avoid unintended consequences. With academic relations with China, the emphasis should be on the protection but also the promotion of Canadian interests. These interests include advancing Canada's S&T prowess while protecting and safeguarding our research accomplishments. Now, in my 37th year of full-time work on China, both as a diplomat and academic, I'm wary of simplistic approaches towards a state as complex as China. China now graduates roughly twice the number of university graduates in the United States, but approximately 8 times as many STEM graduates, science, technology, engineering, and mathematics. These numbers, projected over several years, have given the PRC a world-class research capacity, further bolstered by the network of private high-tech firms, state and corporate research laboratories. That advantage will grow. Chinese universities and research labs are lavishly supported with state funds. We see the PRC S&T development perhaps most dramatically in the Chinese space program with a planned lunar base, permanent Earth orbiting space station, and Mars missions. But Chinese health research is also one of the factors behind the reality that China's life expectancy now exceeds that of the United States. Several decades ago, while in Hong Kong, where I was serving at our mission, my son's use of his hand was restored after an injury by the application of the early PRC development of microsurgery techniques, which are now in broad international application. The point is that we need to draw from China as much advanced knowledge as possible while minimizing risks associated with sensitive technologies that either involve security risks to Canada or which are needed to protect our own accomplishments from theft. But my premise is that cutting off all federal funding to cooperative research with China risks isolating Canadian researchers from key NS&T developments within China to the detriment of our own research, particularly if we're not in alignment with our allies. The tricky part is not whether we should fund projects in cooperation with Chinese research, but whether or not the cooperation is, in each case, in Canada's net interest. The Canadian government, in my opinion, led by ISED, has the capacity to lead on evaluation of funding proposals with the involvement of CSIS, GAC, DND, and other agencies, also taking outside advice from our own researchers and our allies as necessary. What is urgently needed, I believe, is the development within ISED of a list of problematic PRC entities, and this may be already be in process, such as the PLA-dominated National University of Science and Technology, where research collaboration clearly carries risks. This list of problematic research should be paired with a list of problematic research topics that exclude any shared research on those topics, no matter what the Chinese partner. Our allies are doing this. When I called the U.S. State Department in Washington in late 2022, I was told that the overarching U.S. government approach to scientific cooperation with China was, quote, promote and protect. That is, to continue to promote academic research of the PRC, but to be vigilant in protecting U.S. research and researchers. The U.S. National Institutes of Health, the largest funder of medical research in the world, has not cut off funding of joint U.S. medical research, U.S.-China medical research. But what they have done instead is to implement controls on the nature of research and administrative measures to ensure that U.S. and PRC researchers comply with NIH regulations, because there have been cases where this has not been the case. In Europe, Germany, France, the UK, and the EU, they have not stopped research cooperation with China. They have rather proposed or implemented measures to reduce risks involving sensitive technologies that are key to either European security or the health of European research institutions and high-tech companies. I commend you the excellent...
I'm sorry, I'm going to have to cut you off
I'll stop right there.
But
Thank you, Chair.
we almost got to the end of your presentation, and hopefully we can work that into some of your answers to some of the topics that you haven't.
And thank you.
And thank you. And thank you to all of our witnesses for getting us going on this. Now I'll turn it over to Corey Tucker from the Conservatives for 6 minutes, please.
Thank you so much for the chair, and to the presenters, thank you for being here today. I'm going to ask a series of questions, and everyone's welcome to provide their answers in a written brief if they don't get a chance to answer the questions here today. So, Benjamin Fung, do you think we need a foreign registry or a foreign agent registry in Canada? Yes or no?
Yes, foreign registry, yeah, that will help.
And given the obvious urgency of this issue, do you think the federal government's moving quick enough to establish a foreign agent registry?
I believe it is already actively discussing at different levels. Whether it's fast enough, I'm not sure whether it's fast enough.
And with your testimony, you talked about the analogy as feet, trap, kill, if that's correct. And you experience a little bit of this where there was offering of financial compensation 3 times your salary. Is that the feet part then?
That's the feet part. And I see other professors are falling to the other two steps.
Okay.
Yeah.
Now, talk about the next 2 steps in a little bit more detail.
Yeah, so usually it's a typical strategy that the Chinese government often use to recruit researchers.
Okay.
So once a professor have the funding, then they will start expanding their team. Let's say we will hire more PhD students, more graduate students, and a PhD student takes typically 4 to 5 years to complete the degree. So then after 1 or 2 years, we kind of that professor we kind of rely on that funding, rely on that company to keep providing the funding. Otherwise, we cannot support the PhD students. So that's the moment that is trapped, right? So, and that's the moment that the company or CCP government may ask the professor to do something that may go against their own will.
And now, unfortunately, the last term was kill.
Yeah, kill, I don't mean really
No,
harming
I
the
get it.
professor, but basically saying something that is not true or ruining the reputations of the professor by saying something that is not true.
So we also had former CSIS counterintelligence officer Michael Joan Katsu has said that if the National Counterinterference Office promised in the budget this spring ever gets off the ground, it should report directly to the House of Commons rather than directly to a minister. It's a little bit inside baseball, but the difference is the House of Commons represents all 338 ridings in all of Canada. A minister will be tied to reporting to his boss or hers, the Prime Minister. Would you agree that if this gets off the ground, that it should be to all members of Parliament, not just the minister and the party of the day?
I'm not familiar with the internal process, so I cannot really comment on that. But for CSIS, I would like to see more actions, not just one-way directions of collecting information.
Okay. And during the last election, we heard lots about WeChat and some of the communications going on that platform. Are you on that social media platform?
Personally, I'm not using WeChat.
Okay.
Yeah. But I have looked into some of my research are working on that directions, on disinformation. So we see that during the election time, some of the WeChat groups are very active, and so sometimes many of those WeChat groups are just ordinary WeChat group, like they talk about going to dinner, going to BBQ, or some leisure activities. But during the election time, sometimes a different group of people will emerge and then start talking about or promoting or go against some specific candidates. And so that's what we have observed in the group.
And I understand that you're an expert in cybersecurity and data mining is one of your areas of expertise. Are there risks to students and academic privacy from PRC presence on campus?
So it depends. So when students come, let's say when they arrive in Canada, so depending on where they get the funding, right? If they are like CSC sponsored, then I would say the risk is higher. And depending on what topic they are working on, right? So, for example, for myself, I also sometimes I do take students from China, but I have an array of projects that I can choose from, right? I can carefully assign a topic to different types of students. So that is what I'm doing. But for other professors, I'm not sure. When they have CSC sponsored students, some of them they just work like a regular graduate student from Canada. I don't see the difference between them. Yeah.
Have you seen agents or employees of Huawei on campus interacting with staff or students on different research projects?
Yeah, several years ago, they are much more active, and many, I would say, activities in engineering and computer science, they are directly sponsored by Huawei.
Okay.
But they were making some unreasonable requests to some of the activities organizer. And recently I see that the students basically reject that sponsorship.
But nothing directly with you, so I won't want you to expand on the Huawei connection with other professors or students. But on your example,
Actually, we're just at time now.
20 seconds?
No, we're at time.
Okay.
But thank you, and thank you for the answers as well. Now we'll turn over to Charles Sousa from the Liberals for 6 minutes, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Sorry. Thank you, Mr. Chair, and colleagues. This is, I won't be on this committee going forward, but I do want to express my thanks to all of you for our discussions and debates. And I do want to thank the witnesses for being here today and for coming forward. I have two questions in essence. I'll start, if I may, with Professor Holden. As you've mentioned, Professor, this is a rather complex issue, and there's an importance with the research ecosystem that is as open as possible and as secure as necessary. And our government certainly has been working towards improving research security in Canada for some time, since, well, in 2021, Innovation Science and Industry Canada released its national security guidelines for research partnerships. And this took aim at supporting researchers to integrate national security considerations in the development, evaluation, and funding of research partnerships. So I'm going to ask two questions, and I'm going to start with Professor Holden. So can you reaffirm some of your concerns then with how we proceed to limit the extent of collaboration with certain countries, to be agnostic, and yet at the same time provide for research that is open and allows us to benefit from the degree of expertise that exists in other parts of the world?
Well, resources at time are always limited. So I guess my point would be, I'm not sure you can always be agnostic. I mean, it's pretty clear that the PRC, North Korea, Iran, and Russia pose risks that the others do not. And hence, I'd argue focusing on the most immediate problems is rational. Our collaboration with China, for a bunch of reasons, mainly the fact that Chinese have advanced so quickly and so far, China will probably occupy the lion's share. I'm not aware of any research collaboration with North Korea, for example, virtually none with Iran, and very little with Russia in the current circumstances. So I think you have to pick your targets. The challenge is one must, in my view, respect academic autonomy of universities, but where there's a legitimate security concern, and there are legitimate security concerns, that is where the government of Canada legitimately focuses. And where they have the funding weapon, they should certainly, or the funding control, they should certainly exercise it. Where they believe it's not in the net interest. But I would emphasize there are research topics, be it climate change, environmental concerns, health research, where there is clear benefit to Canada of our researchers working with Chinese. And if you cut that off completely, one of the things you're going to find is some of our best researchers will simply decamp to the US or Europe where there are no such barriers, or at least the barriers may be somewhat more liberal. Working with our allies to find common approaches, I think, reduces that risk. There's also the bigger issue, I think, of isolating China. China went through very long periods historically, including up to the end of the Cultural Revolution. The movement of students back and forth, I think, helps leaven an open Chinese society. Chinese students that I deal with on a regular basis are far more knowledgeable of the outside world and outside ways of living than was the case before.
Thank you for that. And now I want to turn this over to Professor Fung and Ms. Wong. This is obviously a very serious issue. What you've highlighted today in terms of the security threat and what is not a threat, you've actually identified, and I have said that there's interference that's being engaged this moment by some of your colleagues that are targets, as you have been as well. And that's a very serious issue. I've also heard instances, though, from members of the diaspora of the Chinese community and others that are students and so forth, that there's some degree of concern and worry about racism, discrimination, and some biases towards certain researchers from Chinese origin. And as a consequence, many are calling for a full boycott, or calling for what seems like maybe an ineffective method, but some are saying cut everything. and not deal with certain individuals from China. Can you elaborate how you balance the innocent students that are coming here who really want to do their best and they have good intentions, and yet you have this concern of undue influence, undue harm?
If I may, I think what you mean by the country agnostic and solution, that itself is the start of that anti-racist approach in addressing national security concerns when it comes to academia. And like I said, there's also other regime security in academia that Beijing is interested in advancing. I think, for one, we need to look at the conduct of the companies, individuals, and entities we collaborate with. If, for example, an entity that seeks to collaborate with a Canadian researcher is actively violating international human rights law, then that should be a signal that maybe we shouldn't collaborate with that individual. So that's what I mean by looking at the conduct rather than the country of origin. Another issue when it comes to international collaboration is there are privacy laws and data laws that are different from Canada. So we can collaborate with a Chinese actor who has obtained data legally in China, but the way that they have obtained the data may not be legal in Canada. So that creates kind of this moral gray area where is it ethical for a Canadian researcher to continue to collaborate with this individual who has obtained data not possibly through the legal way in Canada, but legally elsewhere? And how would that research data be stored? Is it stored in China or is it stored in Canada? All of those factors come into play when we talk about how to balance that active academic freedom to ensure that there's free and transparent collaboration where researchers are empowered and acknowledging.
Thank you very much.
Sorry.
We'll turn over to Maxime Jean-Caf for 6 minutes.
Merci, Monsieur le Président. Je salue les...
Thank you, Chair, and I would like to welcome the witnesses who've joined us today. Chair, my first question is for Professor Holden. I think your experience is clear for all to see. We're Minister of Foreign Affairs for Canada in 1976. You mentioned the mandate that you have from the University of Alberta. I would like to understand, and I'm sure that the public would like to understand as well, on a scale from 1 to 10, what is the level of concern that we should have about Chinese interference in Canada's science and research ecosystem?
For the question and the kind comments. On a scale of 1 to 10, I would presume, and here again, to me, you have to look at the national issues. That which is in the risks of research collaboration in the United States or France are not the same as with China or Russia. So I'm not sure that the agnostic approach fully works. And I would assign to the case of China, I'd probably say it would be about an 8. But that does not mean that the door is closed or should be closed. It means care is needed. And I would call from this, I'd recommend this excellent report from MIT, came out in November of last year. They had 9 eminent scholars. They took almost 18 months, I think, to write the report. It's available online. And there's one line in that jumped out at me, and it is as follows. We believe the United States has more to lose than to gain if broad, sweeping restrictions on academic research are implemented that degrade or dismantle the U.S. system of open science. In other words, this is an organization that in its same document talks about they have classified labs that work for the Department of Defense that are basically locked off to all foreigners. You can walk and chew gum at the same time. You can do essential, useful, meaningful research collaboration on health, environment with China. You can also try and keep that door tightly locked on sensitive technologies. Over.
Merci, Professor Holden. Je comprends bien ce que vous...
Thank you, Professor Holden. I understand the nuance that you're showing us here, remaining competitive and nevertheless mitigating risks thanks to international security interventions. I would like to hear you on the following. I'm speaking of Margaret Rickowick-Johnson, who stated that we should have a number of rules that should apply when we work with China and other countries. This is a researcher from NSERC saying the following. I'd like to know what sort of criteria we should use to categorize these countries.
previously served as a senior fellow of the China Institute at the University of Alberta. I know her well. I think that clearly a category 1 would include our NATO allies and those closest to us, where there's no risk. There are a group of independent democratic countries, largely in Europe but in other continents as well, with whom I think concerns are modest. And then there are other countries which are, because of their size, in the case of China, different political systems, radically different political systems, non-democratic, with large militaries, where caution is more warranted. So that's on a national basis. But even within that, you have to differentiate between the types of research. It's quite feasible that a Canadian researcher might be working with a German researcher who, unbeknownst to the Canadian researcher, has a Chinese partner. So caution is needed as well. Who are your partners? I would ask, if you're the Canadian researcher, who else are you working with? Because once it's leaked from that lab in Canada or from the intellectual property of the individual, it's hard to control where it goes. But primordial, there are issues of health, child health, aging, biodiversity, where it is clear it's in the planet's interest, as well as China's and Canada's, that we collaborate and advance. And that's where there has to be this differentiation, not just on the country, but also on the subject matter, where governments and universities and researchers have categories of high risk, medium, and no risk. And the no risk may have great benefit. Over.
Merci beaucoup.
Thank you very much, Professor. Earlier, you mentioned the 8 on a scale of 1 to 10 as being the level of worry that should be ours regarding Chinese interference in science and research here in Canada. I'd like you to compare something, science and security. How does Canada compare to the other G7 countries and the OCDE as well regarding our protection of research?
Well, I think things are evolving very quickly. I think I could say that the Americans have been in the lead in the sense of identifying risks and dealing with them. They have the most to protect, be it in military or science or technology, and they have very large national institutions. But again, in Washington, meeting with 8 different individuals from various agencies, they're also working very carefully to respect the autonomy of universities, to have a very light touch when possible. They believe, as I believe, there are too few North Americans studying in China. We need to understand that place. It's going to be a dominant part of this 21st century. We ought to have more researchers there. Many of these people can go without risk, depending on what the subject matter is. Again, if it's investigations of paleontology, et cetera, zero risk, but you gain a knowledge of how the Chinese work and think. The French and Germans have just woken up to the risk. Thank you.
Thank you. I wish we could go on, but just to balance time fairly, I'm going to turn over to Richard Channing from the NDP, please.
Well, thank you, and thanks to all the witnesses for being here today. I'm going to start with Ms. Wong and your comment about this country agnostic approach, and listening to Mr. Holden, I'm just wondering if maybe it's a bit of semantics that is the difference here. I mean, I assume by a country agnostic, you would not say China is out. You know, you would say, let's look at the research, you know, the topic of the research, the entity that you're dealing with, as Mr. Holden was saying, and, you know, look at the level of risk and use that. Is that the kind of approach you're talking about, rather than just putting all the countries into different boxes from the start?
Yes, in a way, but I do think that even if we're collaborating with a U.S. entity that has known human rights violations, our reaction should be the same as we would react to how we would collaborate with a Chinese entity that has human rights violation in its record. That's what I mean by country agnostic, that we should be looking at the conduct of the activities that are being taken by the entity that we're collaborating with or potentially collaborating with.
And is that conduct always known beforehand? I mean, if this is a new agency, if this is a new researcher, how do we assess that?
Yeah, I also another issue is that a lot of these malicious actors will mask their affiliations. They would purposely hide that they're affiliated with state entity or military entities. So it does require a bit of research and a work. And I think this is what Professor Fong was saying, that university research offices could take on a part of that responsibility in vetting which entities are at risk. But ultimately, nothing would beat a federal guideline on who are these entities that have state and military affiliations and may provide those information to state and military entities for other use.
Now, Professor Fung, you talked about some of the lures that these entities were using to try to entrap people, and a lot of that involved large amounts of money, or certainly more money. Would you say that they're, a part of the solution? I can't imagine it's the whole solution, but part of the solution would be for Canadian researchers to be better funded, for Canadian students to be better funded, so that those the lures that are dangled in front of them aren't quite so attractive.
Yeah, definitely, yes. So one way to tackle this is to increase the research funding so that the Canadian students, local students, have more opportunity to do active research in Canada. Another way to tackle the problem is to inform the professor, basically raise the awareness to the engineering and science professor. I see that the public safety has a safeguarding science program. They try to raise awareness at the universities. But one of the meetings I attend, when they come to McGill, it's excellent presentations, but I see that the attendees are not really from engineering and science. So one way to tackle the problem is to, I would say, educate the professor, raise awareness, and then let them know the potential risk. That's very important. And another level is at the research office. So we need to train the research officers to identify what are the potential foreign interference entities. Sometimes this may require the additional information from the government agencies. Yeah.
And I'll turn to Mr. Holden. You talked about how ICED could lead this program of assessing the risks with CSIS and GAC also involved. Can you maybe elaborate on the capacity of ICED to do that? You felt that they could take that on, but what is needed and what sort of information would they have to gather?
Well, thank you, Mr. Cannings. I must note that I am actually speaking from your home riding in Penticton at this moment. I'm one of your constituents. But your question is important. And ICED is, I think, is engaged in this process, and they've staffed up a lot of new people. I met many of them when I was in Ottawa. They are also putting funding into the major research universities to create research security positions, which are funded both by the university and by Ottawa, and often staffed by people with security background, including some from CSIS. This is a huge step forward. We're in a different place than we were. But what I'm still waiting for is a list of problematic institutions abroad. Some of these will be Chinese, some of these will be Iranian or Russian, and also a list of problematic areas. And the tricky thing is that those areas are constantly changing. That which is cutting edge and potentially dual use today may be commonplace and in everything you touch in a few days. So that work must proceed apace. The other problem, which I identified in my research for the government of Alberta, was that while the federal government and ICED, the government of Canada, controls the funding which flows to researchers, the provinces control the universities by power of the purse. And so there must be, in my view, very close collaboration between provincial and federal government facilitating a common approach. Because otherwise, you have this powerful university that may or may not take the advice from the federal government. You have the federal government, which has, I believe that the federal funding for research in the universities, I'm guessing here, it's in the range of about 20%. The bulk of the funding comes from the university itself.
Okay, thank you very much. And I left a little bit of extra time because of the reaction of the committee to you being a constituent. It's always good to have constituents in the room. Everybody's somebody's constituent. Welcome to Michelle Rempel-Garner to our committee. It's great to have you here, and with your experience, I look forward to you being a member of the committee. You have 5 minutes, please.
Thank you, Chair. So the way I'd like to spend my time, and just quickly by way of background, I did manage the sponsored research portfolio of a major Canadian university. So Dr. Fung, when you talk about the Research Services Office, used to be this girl here. So what I'd like to do is just sort of try and encapsulate some of the recommendations and common themes that have come up in testimony, and then just get some validation on whether you not we're thinking about this the right way. So I think in Canada there's a couple of frameworks that could be applied to the principles that you're talking about, and they're not necessarily related. But first of all, the integrity regime within procurement, as well as the Safe Third Country Agreement. And those two have commonalities in that they are country agnostic, they're entity agnostic. The government has set a list of guidelines by which it will do business with in procurement, and whether or not how it would apply refugee status. Do you think that, would you recommend that any approach that the federal government takes be country agnostic, be that focus on quantitative, objective metrics in terms of engagement with countries and entities, and that list should be evaluated on, let's say, an annual or regular basis? Dr. Fung.
I agree that there should be a country agnostic approach. Yes, there should be some metrics for measuring, but sometimes, for information, that is not sufficient, right?
Sherry. My sister's name, same spelling too. Anyway.
Yeah, I mean, country agnostic is really important. The entity based on conduct, so based on the activities that that particular entity has taken on, I do agree that it has to be reevaluated, as well as, I mean, for state entities, once they catch on that you're catching on to them, they change their name and they change their affiliation. So it needs to evolve with the challenges that we are going to face.
So ongoing review of eligibility is should be a key recommendation for our committee. Okay. The other thing is the federal government has tabled national security guidelines for research partnerships. I think that gets us maybe 10% of the way where we need to be on this issue. It strikes me that there aren't any enforcement criteria or enforcement rules in this set of guidelines. Do you think that any eligibility criteria that the federal government ties to either federal research funding or support for research partnerships should have some enforcement criteria if rules are broken? Yes or no, Dr. Fung?
So sure, yes.
Ms. Wong? Sure. Yes, thank you. The other thing that I note is that right now where we're at is there really isn't a way for Canadian universities to determine in an ever-changing landscape what the rules are. So I would argue that it's actually impossible for a research services office to make that determination. Do you think it would be the role appropriate for the role of the federal government to take on and develop a list of both countries and entities that the federal government would support institutions or give any sort of support to institutions that are engaging in research partnerships with, that would be subject to a set of rules and regulations that were designed to safeguard things like national security, prevent intellectual property theft, and the safety of Canadians? I mean, that list could be augmented. And that prescribed controls or safeguards would need to be in place prior to federal funding being allocated to that type of partnership, and that system would then be evaluated on an ongoing basis. Is that kind of where your thinking's at for a framework that the government should be developing?
About a minute left.
Thank you. And Ms. Wong?
Yeah, that would be the ideal way that we can move forward.
Amazing. Do you think that it's important for federal research the granting councils, let's say NSERC, CIHR, CFI, et cetera, that type of a framework be inserted into their eligibility criteria for institutional eligibility once it's put together by the federal government? Yes or no? Yes. Ms. Wong?
I've never actually submitted a tri-council research grant, so I would not be at liberty to
Institutional
say.
eligibility, it's important, right? And I think that there needs to be some tie-in to institutional eligibility as to a framework. So from there, do you then think that the national security guidelines for research partnerships, that perhaps the government needs to significantly augment that particular document, given that it doesn't have these
Okay, we're actually over time at this point. But
always be further.
thank you both, and thank you for the questions. Now over to Lena Metlage-Diab, please,
Thanks,
for
Mr.
5 minutes.
Chair. Thanks to our witnesses for being here. So we're talking about research, and obviously our committee was founded on the science and research agenda because we recognize how important research is to Canada. We're also talking about universities, and before I became a federal parliamentarian, I was a provincial member in my own province, and I recognize the significance and the importance of the provinces and the role that they play with universities and colleges, with the respective, in each of the provinces. So, Professor Fung, you are from McGill. So, with respect to the province of Quebec, obviously, there's a lot of autonomy and independence with respect to how they deal with their own educational system. Can you tell me, how does Quebec, for example, how does the provincial government there work with universities to inform and disseminate information to your institution or your researchers about the risks? And what role do you see provinces have vis-a-vis Canada, for example?
So at the provincial level, there's also research funding that we can apply from. So sometimes foreign governments may try to, or foreign enterprise may try to approach a professor to apply for a grant, just like from ANSWER, from CERC. So the same level of security should be enforced, just like the Research Security Center should be enforced at the provincial level. That's what I see. Yeah.
So, Ms. Wong, you're a graduate student, and you were, here in Ottawa. What have you seen, I guess, in your graduate work based on your personal experience and what, other profs or students or whatever have sort of shared with you?
I am very lucky. I have a very supportive group of professors and students around me, but I don't think that's a similar experience that many of my colleagues have had. Students have expressed they are worried that they're not going to get a certain scholarship in Canada because their views may differ from the professor's view who are issuing the grant. And particularly for individuals like me who are working in sociology, my research is focused on transnational repression. It's quite sensitive in that sense. So I would worry that if I apply for a research grant, that if a professor has pro-Beijing views, that I would not get a scholarship issued to me. I think that's a very similar experience for individuals in the soft sciences when they're applying for scholarships and grants for their own research.
Thank you for that. Professor Holden, I guess I'm going to ask you, you're in Alberta, and I know you hold many hats, but what have you seen from your perspective in that province, for example?
Sure. Well, I can speak to the provinces more generally, I think, because I did a survey in course of preparing my study for the government of Alberta this year. A couple of things. Number one, as I may have already mentioned, the bulk of the research funding is not from the federal government. So the federal government can come up with a whole set of criteria and be absolutely rigid, but the material may still be going out the door. So what's needed, and the provinces, except the very largest provinces, maybe Quebec, Ontario, and BC, perhaps Alberta, may have the resources to do analysis as to security risks. But this is being done to the tune of billions of dollars of taxpayers' money by the federal government, agencies such as CSIS, CSCE, and other agencies of government. So to me, the answer is not 13 security agencies doing analysis. The answer is close collaboration between provinces and the federal government, sharing knowledge and coming up with common approaches. That to me is the best hope. Otherwise, for example, if one province is tough and another is lenient, foreign governments or agencies or individuals will go to the place of least resistance and take advantage of that slacker attitude. It's only if you have a unified national view of universities that's adopted with the full support of the provinces.
So I can't agree with you more. Do you see that happening at any level?
Everything federal provincial is difficult. I accept that. But I refuse to be, I would have given up decades ago if I thought that was the case. The provinces and federal government can still collaborate, and it's in their interest to do so. Individual provinces, some will be more forward than others. And I'm not saying it's a question of simply taking direction from Ottawa. It's a means of sitting down on organized committees that meet on a regular basis to come up with common approaches and to share those approaches to frustrate our enemies and to promote our interests.
Great.
That's
Thank
terrific.
You very much.
Thank you.
And a great discussion. And now for 2.5 minutes, Monsieur Blanchet-Choquin.
Thank you so much, Chair. Let me stick with Professor Holden. You brought up the importance and of the concern that we should have about Chinese interference in scientific research here in Canada. I asked you earlier, if we compare ourselves to other countries, the UK, for example, the USA, the Netherlands, have already undertaken measures to stop or at least slow Chinese interference. I'd like to know, from your point of view, the other OECD and G7 countries, how do we compare to them? Are there practices that they've adopted that we should bring in Canada?
Here or political interference?
La sécurité nationale.
The national security of research. Thank you.
Our counterparts. I was a Canadian official for many years, but I never thought that the things Canadian are always necessarily the very best. I wanted to find the best from elsewhere. And some of those countries you've mentioned are of a scale that is more applicable to ourselves, be it the Netherlands or even France or the UK. Not everything. The US is in many ways a special case. Australia is an interesting case. All of these countries, with the partial exception of the United States, are quite new to this game. If you go back a decade, I found that particularly vis-a-vis collaboration and cooperation with China, there was very little concerned. Yes, if something's on an export control list, fine. If it was a weapon system, fine. Apart from that, what's happened now, though, is that so much of research is dual use. And that which can be put to civilian use may also have a military application. It's true in the communications, a range of things. I would say that study carefully the Netherlands has done. Germany is doing some very interesting things, actually starting even just this summer in terms of tightening the controls. But the tightening I'd emphasize for each of those countries, the same for the EU, is not mean no collaboration with China. It means eyes wide open, careful collaboration, looking at where is this Chinese researcher working, what agency, also what is the subject matter, and if in doubt, say no and perhaps go elsewhere. Some of this would require legislation. If you're actually going to force academics to not collaborate with certain entities, you can use the carrot of money, even federal, provincial, but actually forbidding a professor from collaborating with a foreign entity would require a whole other degree of intervention that we don't have the tools right now. Over.
Great. Thank you very much. And when you mentioned the Universities Canada, U15 and U15 Germany met this summer, and I was able to take part in those discussions. And this was part of our discussion was around security. So over to Richard Canning for the last 2.5 minutes on this study, on this panel.
Well, thank you, and I'll stay with Professor Holden on that last topic about how we manage researchers and research. If there is a researcher getting significant funding directly from a Chinese entity or any other country, is that where you find that we would have to have some sort of legislation to regulate that? And if so, where would that legislation live? Would it be federal or provincial? I'm just curious. It seems a bit of a mess.
And it would be, thank you very much, Mr. Canning, and it would be a departure from our normal procedure. One of the great strengths, as in that MIT study, is the open nature of science in the United States and in Canada. I think we have to tread carefully if you're going to come in with a legislative hammer on universities, which have lots of good reasons to want to be independent and autonomous. I would rather argue that funding coming in really matters on the question of the subject matter. If the Chinese are roping of the Canadian, I happen to know a couple of researchers at the University of Alberta who came up working sometimes with their Chinese collaborators on a vaccine for hepatitis C that saved hundreds of thousands, perhaps millions of lives. I don't think we really care where that money came from. If the subject matter is a cutting edge dual use matter, that's another thing. And I think that's where it would probably have to be a mix of federal and provincial legislation. And I know how sensitive the provinces are, quite legitimately, about education being in their domain. This would be a diplomatic and legislative nightmare. But having the perfect, don't let the perfect get in the way of the good. Sensitizing universities, sensitizing the researchers, sensitizing parliamentarians and the public as the advantages and risks. And it is a mix of both, absolutely a mix of both. And one of the great strengths in the MIT study, if you choose to read it, it points out how few U.S. scientists are being graduated compared to the United States. But the secret sauce that America has and Canada has is all this great talent we harvest from overseas. Chinese, Indian, Iranian, even Russian researchers, students who come to us and bring their knowledge to us. That's one of the ways we make up for that lack of enough internal candidates for top research jobs. Over.
Great, thank you very much. Fascinating discussion this afternoon. I wish we could go on, but we are at time. So thank you to our witnesses, Benjamin Fung and Cherie Wong, and also for Gordon Holden, who's the Director Emeritus of the China Institute at the University of Alberta, and I can see your service is very valuable not only to them but to our country. So thank you for your service there. You can submit any information that might have arisen from our discussion today to our clerk, and she'll get it to the analysts. The analysts have assured me they could find the MIT report that's been referenced a few times here, but if there's any other information, please do send it on. And we'll now be suspending briefly so that our next panel can come together. We have 3 witnesses via video conference that will have to be tested out. So I'll ask the witnesses here to sign out, and thank you for coming, and thank you for signing in and being part of this valuable discussion.
Merci. Au revoir. Thank you.
Okay. Changing gears, we're going to go into a new study. This one is the study on pay gaps, long-term impacts of pay gaps experienced by different genders and equity-seeking groups among faculty at Canadian universities. Welcome back. Pursuant to Standing Order 10831 and the motion adopted by the committee on Monday, December 5th, 2023, the committee commences its study on the long-term impacts of pay gaps experienced by different genders and equity-seeking groups among faculty at Canadian universities. We're having a little bit of technical startup. I can see that one of our witnesses just rejoined us, and hopefully the reboot on the computer has worked. We have two individuals that will be presenting together, and it's been agreed to share the time over 10 minutes at the beginning. That's Tracy Smith-Carrier, Canada Research Chair Tier 2 in Advancing the UN Sustainable Development Goals from the Royal Roads University via video conference. And with her, we have Marcy Penner, who's the Associate Professor, Department of Psychology at King's University College, Western University, by video conference. Also on video conference, we have Visions of Science, represented by Dina Alkouli, Senior Director of Impact and Learning, via video conference. So each of you will have 5 minutes. As I said, the two people as individuals will be working together on sharing 10 minutes between them. So if you're ready to start, maybe I could turn it over to Ms. Alkouli or Ms. Smith-Carrier, whoever's starting.
It's Tracy and Marcy.
I believe it's me.
Okay. Tracy,
All
over
right.
to you.
Thank you very much. Good afternoon. We are grateful to the House of Commons Standing Committee on Science and Research for inviting us to present today and for facilitating this important discussion. My name is Tracy Smith-Carrier. I'm an associate professor in the School of Humanitarian Studies at Royal Roads University in Victoria, BC, and the Canada Research Chair in Advancing the UN Sustainable Development Goals. I'm here with my colleague, Dr. Marcy Penner, Associate Professor in the Department of Psychology at King's University College at Western University. Dr. Penner and I have collaborated to conduct research on pay inequities in academia, including publishing a paper on the long-term implications of the gender pay and pension gap on faculty at Canadian universities.
There is a substantial and persistent gender pay gap for faculty at Canadian universities. According to Statistics Canada in 2023, full-time women faculty earn 7.4% less on average for the same work. The gender pay gap varied by institution, ranging from $150 a year to almost $25,000 a year, reflecting a gender pay gap of 0 to 15%. Momani and colleagues demonstrated that pay gaps also vary by discipline. Gender gaps are larger in STEM fields and showed that the gender pay gap widens as women advance in academia and doubles for women who are deans. The Canadian Association of University Teachers quantified diversity pay gaps for Indigenous and racialized faculty, as well as looking at the intersection with gender. Using 2016 census data, they showed that Indigenous university faculty, both men and women, earned 26% less than non-racialized men faculty. COUT also found that racialized university faculty on average earned 12% less than faculty overall. There was a diversity pay gap for university faculty across all racialized groups, ranging from 3% to 28%. Moreover, the gender pay gap for racialized women faculty in Canada was double that of non-racialized women. Many Canadian universities have used salary anomaly studies to investigate the gender pay gap at their institution and have made positive salary adjustments, either across the board to all women faculty or on an individual basis. These salary adjustments have not been retroactive at any university. Salary anomaly studies and salary corrections have been driven by collective bargaining between faculty associations and university employers rather than through legislation. Pay gaps still exist at universities even after multiple rounds of adjustments, because without addressing the systemic bias that leads to pay differences, the gap is reintroduced in starting salaries and promotion and merit decisions.
Four factors contribute to the gender wage gap in universities: disparities in starting salaries, differentials in performance and merit pay, differences in the rates of and times to promotion, and incongruities related to parental and other caregiving leaves. Although collective agreements identify salary floors for specific academic ranks, starting salaries largely continue to be negotiated, interpreted by university administrators that may or may not be cognizant of implicit gender bias. Women's experience and performance and merit are often undervalued in academic and other settings. Research has shown that in experiments where the identical resume is presented, but with either a typical man's or a woman's name, those with a man's name are judged as more competent and are offered a higher starting salary. When applying to a National Research Council for funding, women need more than twice the academic output of men to receive the same competency score. Moreover, men's earnings rise significantly with academic productivity, whereas women's do not. Men are also more likely to be promoted, and women who are promoted take longer, on average, to be promoted than men, despite research that confirms that women are just as likely to ask for promotions and raises as men. The take-up of parental and caregiving leave has further punitive effects that impact when women start their careers, the breaks they accumulate over their career, and the decisions they make when and if to seek promotion.
The gender pay gap clearly has long-term financial implications for women professors across their careers and retirement, but the cumulative impact had not previously been reported. In our research, in collaboration with Dr. Erin Chekala, now at Brescia University College, and Dr. Carol Lagauche from Western University, we estimated the combined effects of the gender pay gap on salary and on employer pension plan earnings across a women professor's career and retirement using one Canadian institution as a case study. Taking the gender pay gap reported for that institution by Statistics Canada, approximately $9,000 in 2020, as a difference in starting salaries, we simulated career trajectories for a new woman and man faculty member just beginning their careers at the institution and calculated the cumulative difference using the institution's salary and pension formulas. In our calculations, we made data-informed assumptions about the expected length of career, age of retirement, and lifespan. We also made a conservative estimate about salary increases, 1% per year as per Bill 124 in Ontario. We found that the difference in starting salaries alone, with no difference in time to promotion, led to a gender gap in pay and pension of $454,000 across a career and retirement if both professors were promoted to associate professor, and $468,000 if both professors were promoted to full professor. However, men are more likely to be full professors than women. Only 3 in 10 full professors in Canada are women. With the same difference in starting salary, if the woman professor was not promoted to full professor, but her male colleague was, it led to a gender gap in pay and pension of $660,000 across a career and retirement. Our research shows that only looking at salary leads us to substantially underestimate the long-term effects of pay gaps. In retirement, the gender pension gap translated to a $7,000 to $12,250 a year difference in employer pension, or $580 to $1,020 per month. Our calculations are a conservative estimate of the impact of the gender pay gap at Canadian universities. Importantly, unlike many universities, the case study institution does not have performance or merit pay or make market value adjustments, which eliminates multiple decision points where bias could be introduced. Our own work focused solely on gender because race was not a variable provided in the Statistics Canada data that we used. Our values were based on all women professors combined. We know from others' work that the pay gap for racialized women professors in Canada is double that of non-racialized women, so the long-term financial impact of the gender pay and pension gap for racialized women professors will be larger than our calculations for women professors overall.
Here are our recommendations for your consideration. First, gender pay equity studies will continue to be needed to rectify ongoing wage disparities. These should look not only at differences in pay, but the longer-term impacts of these differentials, including implications for pensionable incomes, both occupational and policy-related, for example, CPP or QPP. Second, more research on ways to remedy systemic biases against equity-denied groups in universities and broadly in society will be valuable in helping to meaningfully close the gap permanently. Three, as being recognized and introduced in pay transparency legislation across Canada, including Bill 13 in BC, the promotion of transparency in salary negotiations and pay structures is vital to curb opportunities for bias to creep into salary, performance, and promotional decisions. Four, seeking to extend pay and pension equity provisions to equity-denied groups is imperative. This requires greater data collection, research, and pay equity studies on the short and long-term consequences, not only of wage and pension differentials, but also on characteristics of the job, for example, unionization or the ability to gain tenure, and the ways that informal labor, for example, parental and caregiving work, yield significant labor disadvantages for some faculty more so than others. Five, independent research is needed to determine whether institutional pay equity studies and the interventions to address pay equity described therein are in fact remedying pay inequities. We recommend that Statistics Canada publish gender and diversity pay gaps at appropriate aggregate levels and make this information publicly available. And finally, we recommend that institutions be required to provide gender and diversity pay gap information when applying for federal funding. In closing, we commend the SRSR for supporting Standing Order 108, which we think is vital to provide more equitable pay for women faculty and academics from equity-denied groups. Our research shows that only looking at salary leads to a substantial underestimate of the long-term effects of pay gaps. We estimate that the impact of gender pay and pension gap is $454,000 to $660,000 over the course of an academic career and retirement. Thank you.
Great. Thank you both for your testimony. And Ms. Penner, sorry I missed you at the beginning. You're on a different part of the Zoom screen, so I put the wrong two people together. But thank you both for your testimony. And now we'll go over to Dina El-Khouly from the Visions of Science for 5 minutes, please.
Thanks so much for having me today. Hello, everyone. My name is Dina El-Khouly. I'm here representing Visions of Science, where I'm the Director of Impact and Learning. I'm providing testimony from the perspective of an organization working with youth from low-income and racialized communities with a focus on Black youth. We work to encourage our youth's participation and career pursuit in science, technology, engineering, and math. So while we have substantial evidence that illustrates and quantifies the gender pay inequity, we have little data around other dimensions of marginalizations, as the other witnesses have shared. In a study by the Canadian Association of University Teachers, they found that racialized university educators are paid almost 15% less than their white counterparts. And another peer-reviewed study also found that racialized and Indigenous professors earn lower wages even after controlling for variables such as years of service and academic level. The Canadian Journal of Higher Education published a study that examined differences in tenure and promotion among faculty across 8 Canadian universities, which found that racialized faculty had 54% lower odds of being tenured and 50% lower odds of being promoted to associate professor than non-racialized faculty. This also impacts the next generation of scientists coming into the field. One way is through a lack of representation. As faculty are paid inequitably and pushed out in a variety of ways, there are few who remain and can serve as inspiration, belonging, and support for future faculty from their communities. Another is access to high pay. Youth from our communities are motivated by earning potential as a means of pulling themselves and their families out of poverty. So inadequate pay is an important deterrent for youth wanting to pursue a particular career path. This is not only a matter of equity. Lived experience is both relevant and critical for expanding our knowledge economy. Studies have shown that underrepresented groups produce higher rates of scientific novelty, yet their novel contributions are taken up by other scholars at lower rates than their peers, and equally impactful contributions of gender and racial minorities are less likely to result in successful scientific careers. Canada ultimately pays for this in more narrow research, underutilized expertise, and stifling divergent ways of thinking that are critical for innovation. These gaps are caused by both education and employment barriers. Education barriers that push students, especially Black and Indigenous students, out of school at every level and prevent them from having the prerequisites required for university STEM education. And workplace barriers through both outward and unconscious discrimination, nepotism, workplace culture that alienates marginalized faculty, structural barriers that punish the essential work of teaching, mentoring, outreach, and service that are disproportionately taken on by marginalized faculty. At the workplace level, there is a lot that universities can do. They can designate faculty positions for those from marginalized communities. They can be intentional about elevating their work and providing opportunities for their promotion and uptake. They can reflect lived experience and responsibilities such as teaching, outreach, mentoring, committee, and equity work that ultimately benefits the university as well as the country as a whole in their pay structure, workload, and role expectations. They can increase transparency around compensation, promotion, and tenure decisions, and they can invest in the professional development of underrepresented faculty to diversify their leadership. We also have such limited data that enables people to continue to deny these problems exist and keeps the issues under-researched. Universities should be required to publish data about their student body and of their faculty by gender, race, indigeneity, disability, sexual orientation, and gender identity. Lastly, we cannot narrow our focus to just the tip of the iceberg. Early and ongoing investment is key, and that means investing in education through both financial support for post-secondary and through out-of-school time learning that specifically serves those from marginalized communities. This we have found is absolutely critical for building their capacity and belonging in STEM outside of the often alienating context of the classroom. Thanks so much for your time.
Thank you for your presentation. And we'll start off with Mr. Soroka for 6 minutes, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you to the witnesses for coming today. I guess I'll start my first question with Dr. Penner and Mrs. Smith-Carrier. You know, there's a lot of statistics out there, and sometimes I hate to use the term that they manipulate them, but I've looked online and there's a few universities are saying, oh, once you start comparing apples to apples, actually our pay equity is very close, so it's not changing that much. But the information you've provided, I think you've delved into it a lot better, and there's a lot more information. It's a lot more accurate. One of my first questions, though, is did you find that there were differences between provinces, and were certain provinces more equally representative, meaning that they pay equally the same, or were they all just about the same?
I'm not sure, Dr. Penner, if you wanted to weigh in, but the case study that we used was at one specific institution in Ontario, in Canada. So we didn't do our modeling across universities. We took that data from other sources.
I will add to Dr. Smith-Carrier's remarks that that data does exist by institution, and so the range that I gave was based on Canadian institutions. I haven't seen that broken down by province, but it's certainly something that could be done with the existing data.
If you have that information or could find that, we'd much appreciate that to supply for us later. One of the other questions that I have is that each university or institution is supposed to have guidelines to make sure that they aren't being discriminatory or making sure that they are paying equally fair right across the board. Did you find that with your study that the guidelines are there? And if the guidelines are there, are they being followed or not?
The guidelines, I think, are there, but it's the interpretation of them. So the subjective bias when an administrator, sits down to look at somebody's CV and determine how many years of experience that they come in with. That's where sort of the bias, I think, comes in. It's not that the salary floors don't exist or that the guidelines don't exist. It's the interpretation when that bias gets introduced in terms of those salary negotiations.
Also, for the Pay Equity Act in Ontario, because a professor is termed a male profession, there is no obligation for universities to deal or to ensure that female faculty are paid the same as male instructors.
I guess I find that quite surprising, the fact that, universities are saying that we're here to treat everyone equally and fair and there shouldn't be any differences, but yet you've proven exactly the opposite. So do you have any reason or rationale why they would be doing this? Like you say, they interpret the information how they want to.
Well, I think that stems from that implicit or unconscious bias that people have against women. That's pervasive across society and is certainly, witnessed in academia. But yeah, I mean, even looking at the data, when you look at looking at names on somebody's CV, if a woman is automatically her experience is undervalued compared to men.
Yeah, I guess I find that quite shocking, because I've always treated everyone equally the same, and to me it didn't matter if you're a man or a woman, whatever role or job I was doing, I tried to pay the exact same, so there wasn't any issues for me, and that's why I find it quite appalling that a university promotes that but yet doesn't stand behind what they're saying. Anyway, I'll leave that little rant myself. I'll go to Ms. El-Kuni. You mentioned that even after correcting for other factors, racialized professors still seem substantially less, or paid less than white professors. Do you believe this to be purely discriminatory, or are there other factors that are causing this pay gap?
Yeah, thank you for the question. I think there are both, like the other witnesses mentioned, outward ways that people can be discriminated against and implicit ways that are part of kind of how we move in our everyday life that we don't even appreciate are ways that we're marginalizing folks. So if, for example, the conversations that we have with a peer, they have a more similar lived experience as us, then we might have a higher affinity to that person. We're more cordial with that person. When a promotional opportunity comes up, I'm more likely to think of that person because I have that relationship with that person. So this all comes down to discrimination, whether that's coming from bad intent or whether that is just kind of the natural way that we move through the world. There's instances of both, of course, but part of this is not coming from a place of, I want to make sure that, women and racialized professors are not, advancing. But if I'm more comfortable around certain people, if those are the type of people that I've kind of been around my whole life, I'm going to, just by the nature of how I move in the world, alienate folks that are dissimilar to me. So it comes a lot from kind of the leadership of the organization, how often those marginalized voices are actually given the power to make these decisions. And if they're not, then the people with the power are going to continue to reproduce these inequities just by nature of how they move in the world.
Thank you. Thank you for the questions. And the time goes quickly. And over to Ms. Bradford for 6 minutes. And thank you for suggesting this study, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And thank you to all three of our witnesses for joining us today. You are our first witnesses in this very important study. So while pay equity falls mostly under provincial jurisdiction, the federal government does have a number of programs which address pay equity. Can you tell the committee more about how these programs support provincial laws? So I think we'll start with Professor Smith-Carrier and Penner on this.
Well, there is the federal equity legislation. However, that pertains to federally regulated employees. So it's only to a set group of employees and not broadly across the board. So if that legislation was expanded to include other employees of other sectors and jurisdictions, including academia, that would be helpful. And as Dr. Penner noted earlier, the division of jobs based on classes that are, male-oriented or female-oriented, in my mind, actually perpetuates some of this issue of, which ones are the male-dominated fields and which are female, assuming that males should be in those fields and women should be in other fields. So while there's some provisions there, I think they're somewhat limited and certainly could be either expanded or reconceptualized to better address equity needs.
I want to turn now to the impacts on the short and long-term consequences of this wage gap on research in Canada. So we know it exists and we know it's unfair, but what is the impact that it's having on our research capability? Yes, probably, again, Smith-Carrier and Ms. Penner?
Well,
Dr.
first
Penner,
of all, I
right.
think, yeah, women are less likely to get funding is an issue, as we noted earlier, that they have to produce 2.5 times as much output, number of publications relative to men to be considered as competent. So that obviously is affecting their ability to get funding. And Marcy or Dr. Penner, would you like to also weigh in on that?
Yeah, so I mean, the amount of funding, the duration of the funding, less likely to have papers published or be accepted for conferences. And also, women bring a different perspective, as do Indigenous faculty and racialized faculty that bring a different perspective and address research questions using different methodologies as well that are lost. If we are, in a search for the truth, we're missing some of that answer.
Thank you. Now, Ms. Al-Cooley, diversity within the Canadian research community is a great benefit to the research coming out of Canada. What impact does the discrepancy in pay have not just on the ability to have a diverse research community, but also taking into consideration access to research positions, the quality and quantity of research being produced in Canada? What are your thoughts on that?
Thank you for the question. Yeah, I think to add on to where they were had started, I think for Black women specifically, they have the worst maternal health outcomes out of all women across Canada. We know that there are many issues with AI that have specific racial biases. We know that climate impacts are impacting marginalized communities at a disproportionate rate than other communities. So all of these are implicitly results of the fact that we don't have researchers that reflect the diversity of our Canadian population, that are they're unable to inform this research. They're unable to inform the innovations that are coming out to address our specific community problems. And so that has an impact on not just folks within the research community, but across our society.
Thank you. So again, to you, Ms. Al-Cooley, this question kind of builds on a previous study that we've completed on this committee. How would low stipends for graduate students and postdoctoral fellows impact equity, diversity, and inclusion within the research community?
Thank you. So one thing that we found is really pervasive with our youth is a need to make money right away. So that's a really big challenge in academia because you need many years of being paid low wages, surviving on stipends, surviving on very small grants in order to get to the next career level. And so they're very turned off by that thought that they have to be in their academic position for 10 years before they start to make a real career that can actually pay them to survive. And so many of them are looking for faster ways to enter the workforce so that they can make money to both support themselves as well as their families.
Okay, so Professor Penner, now that we know that these pay discrepancies exist, can you explain why and what the post-secondary institutions are doing to address it?
About 10 seconds.
Quickly.
Yes.
Maybe
So
nothing.
we've talked about this the systematic bias that goes into that decision making, and I do think most of it is implicit. But the salary anomaly studies and those salary corrections are the work that's primarily being done, in addition to reviewing policies and practices around hiring.
Thank you. You did well. Sorry to cut you off, but we have to keep moving. Over to Maxine Blanchet-Choquin.
Merci beaucoup, Monsieur le
Thank you very much, Chair. I thank the witnesses for being here with us today. I will start with a question for Dr. Penner and Dr. Smith-Carrier. I think the study you've just carried out is very interesting. There's a lot more to do, of course. We can see that there has been some improvement, but that there's still a lot to accomplish. I'd like to get a clearer understanding. Who is responsible for the salary caps that we're seeing now between men and women in university faculties?
I think a lot of universities have been addressing this. This is something that's gone back quite some time now. Universities started on this road 50 years ago. It's been a long road, and yes, as you mentioned, there has been significant progress in closing the gap. It's persistent, though. So because, as Dr. Penner noted, universities are basically doing this out of goodwill. There isn't legislation suggesting that they must address it, although a lot of them, I think, would be under a lot of fire now with equity, diversity, inclusion, and decolonization plans in place to not address these issues. So yeah, I think both a combination of both faculty associations, as well as administrators are working on this. But also, I think it's something that affects sessional faculty as well, and something that we haven't talked about yet. And the gap there is even more significant. And we know that non-unionized or members that are not part of an association have an even harder time. So it needs to be even broader to consider those members as well, and not just the faculty association members.
Merci des précisions. Tout à l'heure.
Thank you for those details. Earlier, you said that one way out of this would be to broaden the legislation on salary equity, which now only applies to employees of the federal government. I understand that point of view, but this is the first time I've heard speak of this sort of solution. I know that there is in Quebec and in other provinces as well legislation for salary equity. I'd like to hear you on that. Has this recommendation been supported by various representatives of provincial governments, for example? Are they on board?
Well, there's a lot of differences in what's going on with pay equity legislation and pay transparency. Some having pay transparency commissions now and pay equity boards. I mean, I think ideally it would be nice to be captured across the country. So yeah, I mean, maybe these things would need to be negotiated. Both the federal and the provincial and territorial governments would need to negotiate these things together. Moving away from some of those class or job classes might be something that they would want to consider as part of those negotiations.
D'accord. Merci des.
Very well. Thank you for that explanation. I would like to get a better grasp of the other approach you've suggested. I mentioned that there are salary equity policies in institutions, universities, and in the government as well. I'd like to understand your point of view. These policies are imperfect, such that we still see these salary gaps between men and women, gender gaps. I'd like to understand what a provincial government, such as Quebec, might be able to do or mightn't be able to do that the federal government could do.
Who's that for?
C'est pour Professor Penner and Smith-Carrier.
For Professor Penner and Smith-Carrier.
So I think there's a role both for the provinces to play and a potential role for the federal government as well. So there are a number of programs through which universities receive federal funds, and requiring as part of those as part of the application for those federal funds, asking institutions to provide information about their gender and other diversity pay gaps could be part of that process. Just in the same way that the federal government has played a role in rectifying what was a human rights complaint around Canada research chairs and gender and other diversity imbalances in those positions. So I believe there's a role for both to play. In some provinces, you can only go through a human rights complaint to address these issues because there is no pay equity legislation.
D'accord, merci.
Thank you. No, down to brass tacks. At present, in the funding that the federal government provides to universities for chairs, for example, research chairs and other funding approaches, are there mechanisms available there to avoid gender pay gaps?
Vicky?
Toujours au même
Still for the same people, Dr. Smith-Carey and Professor Penner.
Research chair funding stream is a great example of what can be done. They require equity to be addressed. It has to be done through a survey of every applicant. And that is as the means to determine whether or not they're meeting the benchmarks according to that human rights legislation or court case rather. So yeah, we could extend that to all funding agencies, federal funding agencies, to ensure that equity is represented through that. And use...
Thank you. And if I'm cutting you off, but you can always send in writing to expand on anything at the end of the questions. But we are pretty tight on time this afternoon. And over to Mr. Cannings for 2.5 minutes, please, or for 6 minutes. Sorry.
Well, thank you, and thank you to all the witnesses for being here. I'm going to start with Ms. Alcooley. Thank you especially for being here. I know I've talked to your group before, Vision of Science. It's a group organization that attempts to, I think, encourage people of color, women of color, especially to get involved in STEM research positions and education. And I'm just wondering if we can, back up from the pay gap, but to actually the gap in terms of getting these racialized women into this field. We had testimony in one of our last studies from Dr. Andrade from the University of Toronto, and she said our current system is a massive filter. It's a filter that is filtering out people as a function of their finances, not as a function of their excellence, and not as a function of the likelihood they might be the next Nobel Prize laureate. We are filtering out people who can't take the mental load of living in poverty. And she went on, I think, very eloquently about those challenges that people have. And I'm just wondering if you could maybe take a couple minutes to talk about what Visions of Science does to encourage people that have those challenges ahead of them get involved in research.
Thank you so much. One thing that we try to do with our youth as soon as they hit high school, because as soon as they're of working age, it's an opportunity to lose them on the path of STEM. So we work with our partners to try and bridge internships from as early as grade 10 so that they don't have to work at a grocery store, for example, as opposed to be part of our STEM program in the summer. So we are constantly, I think there's a really big role to play for work integrated learning because these youth have to be paid in order to stay on the trajectory of STEM. So as soon as they become of working age, we need to find ways to ensure that they can learn STEM while also being paid. Otherwise, we are going to lose them to entry-level jobs, and regardless of their interest in STEM, by the time they get to post-secondary, other influence will have pushed them out.
Well, thank you. And I'd like to turn quickly to Dr. Carrier-Smith to talk about some of these biases. I think this is the toughest part. One of the astounding things you mentioned was that a woman has to do two and a half times the amount of research and published work to get the same salary results as a man. That's astounding. We obviously can't do blind, just take the name off the top of their CV, because most of the CV is a list of publications with their name. How do we get around that? Is there a way of doing that with structuring the panels or committees that make these decisions?
Yes, that could be one thing that can be done. Certainly having a faculty association representative at the negotiations itself, so you have somebody who's independent and can also help contribute to the discussion. I think these are things that can be arranged. In terms of the names on the CVs and whatnot, I'm not entirely, like you said, it's not an easy thing to consider in terms of, but perhaps you can have a resume or a CV that is wiped clean in terms of names and just the number of publications or the experiences of that person, and de-identify them in a way. That is a possibility, I think.
So in follow-up research, Dr. Smith-Carrier and I, because this question arose for us as well, what we've identified we've quantified a problem. How do we resolve it? So there's not a lot of good evidence about evidence-based programs and policies to deal with EDID issues. And so we're currently conducting a systematic review of the existing body of evidence, and would be happy to report back our findings, because I think you raise a very important question.
Yeah, absolutely. In fact, some of the diversity training that is offered at the moment, the Harvard review has come out as saying is actually not effective. So, having evidence-informed both policies and in terms of our programs and how we go out about this, I think is really, really important moving forward.
Thank you. I'll leave it there, and I'll pick up my next round. Thank you.
And for the next round, we're just going to have to do a little trimming to go 4 minutes, 4 minutes, 2 minutes, 2 minutes to try and land us on time. If we can then go to Corey Tucker for 4 minutes, please.
Absolutely, and thank you, Chair, and thank you for our witnesses here today. The study that Professor Penner and Tracy Smith-Carrier, I believe, is co-written this, or at least Professor Smith-Carrier has. I was shocked to hear that almost $500,000 was the difference when we added it all up. It is mentioned in that study, though, that Statistics Canada still has not been asking for all the different kinds of information that you need. What are you needing that Stats Canada has not been asking?
Well, if we wanted to expand beyond just gender, is a piece, right? So the diversity piece, equity denied groups. No institution yet has been doing pay equity for equity denied groups outside of gender. So having data on that would be certainly a start. Mandatory data collection.
And at some time in our history of the country, did we record that information?
I think Stats Canada does capture some of it in census data, but all of that, you have to pay for it. It's not publicly available. So if we actually, as one of our recommendations, is to say that we collect the data and we make it publicly available so that we have it, that institutions have it, people have it, that we don't have to pay large sums of money to have access to that information.
Thank you so much. I know we're under a little bit of a time crunch, so we'll move on to the next member.
Well, thank you, Mr. Tucker. And sometimes it's quality over quantity, and quality questions. So thank you. And now we'll go over to Mr. Turnbull for 4 minutes.
So thanks to the witnesses for being here, and thanks for your presentations. This is a really important study, and thanks to my colleague, Ms. Bradford, for bringing this motion forward to do this important work. And certainly it's shocking to hear that in 2023 that we still see such a pay equity gap based on gender and racialization. So I wanted to ask, you had started to answer a question previously about what post-secondary institutions are doing to address this, and I wondered if Ms. Smith-Carrier or Ms. Penner could maybe, Professor, could speak to that in a little bit more detail, because my understanding is you had mentioned before that post-secondary institutions are studying this and that they're reviewing policies, and I'm just wondering, I think you only mentioned hiring processes, but I think there's probably numerous other touch points or points in post-secondary institutions where we could be making a difference. So I'm just wondering if there's additional clarity that you can provide on that.
So in terms of the pay equity studies that a number of institutions have taken on, several have made it those salary adjustments that Dr. Penner mentioned earlier. Some of them have actually done it by giving a flat rate increase to all women faculty of a certain amount. Others have done some sort of a percentage increase. The issue, of course, being some of them haven't embedded them within the pay structure. So it's like a one-off payment, but it doesn't get it embedded into your regular salary moving forward. So you're going to have to keep, adjusting over time because you haven't embedded it into the pay structure. So none of those interventions thus far have been, or very few have been so meaningful to actually close the gap. They're usually just a portion of what would be necessary. So you have to keep adjusting over time. And of course, as time goes on, the gap keeps widening. So it gets more expensive to keep trying to address it. But if they actually were meaningfully addressing it and permanently trying to close it, then I think obviously that's not to say that we wouldn't need to keep addressing it. As long as this sexism is pervasive in society, we'll have to keep addressing it. But taking meaningful steps to close the gap is, I think, what we're suggesting is necessary.
Could I just ask a little bit for more clarity on, I think what we're talking about here is a systemic bias, very clearly. It's systemic racism is what it is that's in the institutions, and we see this present in many institutions. So it's built right in. So how do we address that from a behavioral standpoint when there's so many decisions that are being made? There's upward mobility decisions or promotional decisions that are being made. There's obviously hiring decisions, but I think, I was involved in post-secondary institutions, quite a number of them, and, often you progress from being, a student to a researcher. You go through different degrees and you eventually get hired on as faculty, and then of course you're moving through a whole system thereafter of promotional opportunities as you earn it. And what you're saying, or what you've said today, is that there are forces that are working against women and racialized women in particular, and that those biases are there. So how do we change the behavior in those organizations?
I'm sorry, but we're going to have to leave it there because we've used up the time on the question. But if there is an answer that you can provide, that would be helpful to the clerk. For 2 minutes now, Monsieur Blanchet-Choka.
Merci, Monsieur le Président. Je vais aller droit au but. Je veux être...
Mr. Chair, thank you. Going for a solution. I would like all the witnesses to give us an idea of what the government could do to solve this problem.
Step is providing information about the problem. So the more that we understand the problem, the more we can address it. So by providing that information out of the census data, and there's also UCAS data that we could provide that information, and asking institutions to provide that information and make it public would be a good first step. It's unclear which programs and policies will meaningfully tackle this issue, and so that's where research is being currently underway to try to answer that question.
Merci beaucoup. Est-ce qu'il y a d'autres témoins qui...
Thank you very much. Any other witnesses like to give us some real strong levers, what we could do, what we could enact even as a government?
integrated learning. And this is something that it sounds like other studies have discussed, the impacts of exploring academia on folks who are experiencing poverty is cannot be understated. It's an impossible trajectory for someone who is not coming from a place of economic insecurity. So increasing those stipends for graduate students and funding work integrated learning programs for people from low income communities, particularly racialized communities and women who are coming from racialized communities.
Great answer and great answers. Congratulations on short time and getting those out. Now for the final 2 minutes to Mr. Cannings.
Well, thank you. And I'll just quickly ask Dr. Smith-Carrier and Penner, anything in your research about some hopeful trends? You know, it's surprising, I think, to all of us the extent that this is going on now, but is there a trend as we are getting more women at higher levels? You talked about pay gaps with deans, but, you know, I have women friends who are deans, women friends who are presidents of universities. Is there any trend that process will result in a lessening pay gap when we have those hiring panels, perhaps with more women?
I would say one area where we see hope is that the representation of women, predominantly at the lower ranks, but also rising. The representation of women, Indigenous faculty, racialized faculty has grown. So that's one area that we see improvements. The Momani et al. Study showed that the gaps are actually widening instead of narrowing. So that's an area more of concern. But in terms of representation, which is part of the solution, but not sufficient, we do see some improvement.
Well, thanks. I'll leave it there. I'm a bit disappointed to hear that, but hopefully
thank you. It's the truth hurts sometimes, but thank you to Dr. Penner, Dr. Smith-Carrier, and to Dean Al-Khouly for joining us and for providing your excellent testimony. Thank you to the members for your questions. A really good study to beginning to rolling up our sleeves on. A couple of housekeeping items before we leave. Should the committee wish to travel during the winter 2024 period, we have a deadline of November 10th. So if that's desired, think about that. We can discuss further to ensure that we get a detailed budget put together for travel. Maybe we can pick that up next week. Also, the clerk will provide a deadline in the coming weeks for the witness list for the study on Indigenous knowledge. So that will be moving forward. So think about who you can bring to the table on that. Also, on Monday, September 23rd, or 25th, 2023, we're going to be resuming the studies on both the topics that we had today. And on Monday as well, there's Support Our Science event at 306 Valor from 5:30 to 7. It starts at 5, but we'll be in committee until 5:30. So consider that in your planning as well. So thank you again to everybody for being part of this. And do we have a will of the committee to adjourn? Okay. Thank you. Thanks again, and we'll safe travels. We'll see you next week.